Hey, good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I would like to thank you for joining us this evening for our Promethean Action discussion. And I'll be joined by Michael Steger. I'm kind of just going to turn it over to Michael because I think I want him to get the discussion started for tonight because the nature of it is going to take up a very profound quality of what all of us are feeling in terms of how we respond to the call to action for today based on a truly not just spiritual awakening, but as he profoundly put it and greatly put it in his opening email address for tonight, in terms of organizing on the campus, the college campuses in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. What is happening amongst the young people is very critical. And not just young people, but what's happening in the spiritual realm, in the churches, what's happening on the campuses has taken a awakening of the population that has been long there suppressed, but has now been able to be to flourish. And, we're all seeing this, we're all feeling it. And there's a level of discussion that's going on right now that has been needed for a very long time, that goes way beyond the political nature of what has just the evil that has assumed our society and how to overcome that evil with something greater. And so, as he was saying, you see young people on campuses expressing a hunger for the truth of civilization. And this is expressing itself in many ways, as people have seen. People are saying for the first time in a very long time, or it's ever, they're finding themselves in a church, finding themselves in a mass, finding themselves in a synagogue, wherever they're finding themselves, because they're looking for something deeper. And how do we take that hunger and really feed into it? When you've had a society, you can talk about the Democrats and the blue state and all of the ugliness that we have been suppressed and accustomed to from the standpoint of what's happened with the collapse of civilization in terms of the marriages, births, all of these things that Charlie Kirk recognized, but recognized that I would just end and open it up to Michael to give his thoughts and expressions on this, which was expressed recently in a tribute to him, where he says that if you cannot have a free society if you don't have a society that values God. And I think that that's where we are. How do we truly exemplify and have a society that is truly free and representing this quality, godly quality that is inherent in all of us as human beings? And the question of what does it truly mean to be human? So we're going to have a very profound discussion here tonight, and want to bring you into that discussion. And I think Michael has some insights based on what he's been participating in recently. And so let me just bring him in here so he can get his thoughts in on where we are. Are you? Oh, there you go.
Okay, great. So change the backdrop a little bit tonight. Thanks for everyone for joining in. So as Keisha mentioned, and as the email indicated, I wanted to give kind of a report. I've missed a few weeks of these discussions. Tony and Bruce did a good job, I think, in providing some insights over the last couple of weeks. And in the course of the last month, including about 2 weeks prior to Charlie Kirk's assassination, I had actually gotten onto the college campuses and was engaged with students in just broad discussions to see what was happening. And of course, the Charlie's assassination was a major inflection point um, that impacted that environment kind of specifically. It impacted the whole country, impacted much of the world in different ways. But it's a certain sense of if you don't, if you aren't there, if you're not on the campuses, if you haven't had a chance, and it's a privilege to have been able to do so, to go and engage with young people and to talk to them and find out what they're thinking, what they're confronting, what choices and decisions they're making in response to it. Because you always get a good sense of what's happening based on the decisions people are making, because they've chosen something that they think is in their interest based on what they're confronting. You know, I've talked to a lot of very liberal students. The histrionics are very extreme in some of them, and understandably in some sense. So let me just present kind of maybe the broad characteristics of what the younger generation have experienced, some of which you'll already know. But I think it'll be important to then provide this to then go into one, how they're kind of responding to it, the decisions they're making, the condition they find themselves in. I mean, one clear kind of present problem is if the universities are all just attempting to brainwash them, then how do they figure out how to orient themselves in life beyond the basic moral questions of church and family and children? How do they pursue careers? How do they pursue their own development, conceptually, intellectually? I mean, the whole point of training for a degree is to develop an understanding of an area. Well, how do you develop an understanding of some area that you want to apply and contribute to society if the underlying assumptions within the school are flawed, and you know that they're severely flawed? It's not just left wing, it's clearly something far more demonic than just kind of leftist, you know. Anyway, so that's one of the paradoxes, and you see that all the time. You see it when you see Michael Knowles or Megyn Kelly, who filled in for Charlie Kirk. They were going to be on tour with him, and they did the events at University of Minnesota or Virginia Tech without Charlie Kirk. And you can see the questions, and the questions are, how do I approach life? Like one girl asked Michael Knowles, he's a commentator and an activist and talk show guy for the Daily Wire. You know, I'm 18, I'm going to get married. How do I think about that? Okay. I mean, kids are just trying to figure out, how do I navigate this world now? Can you give me some perspective? And in some sense, that really indicates the generation. There's no formula for them to abide by, at least those who have decided to realize that the current system is just not working. So the broader characteristics are somewhat useful to point out here. So this is a generation that it is the generation. I mean, there's some of their older siblings, of course, in their 20s would have had the same phenomena, but we're including them. But these kids on campus are really the first generation they grew up, were the first, hopefully the last also. And I don't want to make it seem like it's going to go on forever. Their generation has experienced school shootings since they entered into school. So for myself, many of you on this call, you were never in a school when there was the University of Texas, rifle guy on the clock tower in like 68 or 69. There were some random events, obviously in the 60s. People growing up at that time saw the assassination of political leaders. But the idea of random school shootings in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, colleges, these kids all grew up with that. It was an ongoing phenomena. And some of them have been combined with that kind of terror, combined with the kind of the Ritalin type medication for ADD. I mean, these are the kids that grew up where school nurses were now giving your kids strong pharmaceuticals for their behavior without, knowing, or basically telling the parents your child has to be on this, or we have to put them in a special class. So these kids have kind of been raised on that. I mean, I saw that within my generation also. It's been ongoing for a long time, but combine it with the school shootings, combine it with the general deterioration of culture, a lot of the so-called gender and sex obsessions that have kind of come into play have become dominant. These kids grew up with it. Um, Another feature of which they're all now kind of coming to understand a little bit, because it's a little bit complicated even for us to understand, is what is this financial and economic system that we have? Why does everything seem so perversely upside down? Um, why does, for example, many of them have actually stated this, and I never thought about this when I was in college. I figured I would come a time when I had a job and making income and I would buy a home, but I didn't think about like how hard it would be. But I mean, originally came from the Midwest where that wasn't such a big deal. In California, where I ended up going to high school, it was a bigger deal by that point. But nonetheless, these kids think about buying a home. Well, home prices have gone up median across the country in the last 4 years, something like 30%, 35%. So from about 320,000 to over 400,000 today, median. In Michigan, where I am, is in the median, but that's the median nationally. But if you take the interest rate hikes that took place under Biden's inflation agenda, the Inflation Acceleration Act, or whatever it's called, the housing payments with the higher interest rates and the 35% increase on base cost or pricing are upwards of like 60 to 70% higher. The monthly payment is 60 to 70% higher just since COVID in the last 5 years. So that doesn't have, I mean, they've lived with the inflation on food, gas, everything else they've also dealt with, as we all have. But they see these things as a young person, and they're perplexed to understand where it's coming from. And the questions of the bailouts during the 2008 financial crisis, the Bernanke bailouts, 2010, 2013, the Obama Bernanke bailouts really is what they are. And then the bailouts under COVID, which were also somewhat excessive. And of course, that was an operation to remove President Trump. And justify more bailouts in some sense. It was kind of a combo, a twofer. So they don't really understand a lot of the dynamics or how even those things work, how it worked, how it happened. But they kind of know that that's taken place. And this isn't conservatives or liberals. This is across the board. They all see it. They all look at it with a jaundiced eye. The left-wingers, the kids that are liberals or, even really more radical types are hysterical about it. And they almost practically believe that, they justify the fact that we should just hand out money to whoever simply because they know that the level of bailouts and corporate handouts have been astronomical. Like in the course of when I in discussions with them, I oftentimes tell them not to, and because some have chosen not to be victimized by it, some have, and that really is the dividing line. And I'll make that point in a second. But in their lifetime, we took a monetary base of about $1 trillion and increased it at its peak at 9 trillion. It's gone down now to about 6.5 trillion when I checked last week. So they're actually reducing the monetary supply. Now, how much that's having an effect, just as an aside here, how much that's having an effect on the overall financial system is unclear because there's no longer any banking reserve. So a bank doesn't have to have any deposits to lend money. Go figure. You figure that one out. But they are reducing it. But in their lifetime, it went from $1 trillion to about $9 trillion. And so that's something that they're confronting. And they can just you kind of walk into a place. It's like Trump said about like walking into a restaurant, and if the door handle is dirty or if the front entryway is dirty, probably the kitchen's dirty. You kind of enter into society and you see this kind of gross and blatant corruption and strange like effects, and you just kind of have a smell that something's very wrong here. And the housing prices was one indication, even for conservative kids. So these are some of the things that they all recognize. The difference is, of course, a certain larger percentage. I don't really care to estimate. It's not the majority of students, but it's not insignificant, have essentially been destroyed. They've been victims of the insane targeting of them. And a lot of people can say this generation, that generation, this generation, that generation, in terms of characteristics. But what you see from many of them is that there's a real desire to lead. There's a real sharpness. There's a real thoughtfulness. There's also a sense that this society is massively rigged. And that's just the reality that it is. It's been rigged to benefit a certain class. And, in essence, if you're trying to survive and live on wages, it was funny, just to give you an example. One kid said, who wasn't good at math, and a young girl was, and we were doing some math pedagogy, just some challenges to get her to think about principle in a different way. And he said, how much if I paid you $1,000 to teach me that, could you teach it to me like in 6 hours? And she says, $1,000 for 6 hours? You have to pay me a lot more money for 6 hours. And then he said something like, wait till you get into the workplace. And it's true. These kids will have no scope or sense of, because the cost of things is so high. $1,000 seems like nothing. You get into the workforce, and if you're pulling 1,000 net from, first job, entry-level job, you're pulling 1,000 net for a week of work, 6 hours of work, right? A week of work. You're okay. At least you would have thought you would have been okay. So this is probably not the most uncommon thing, but it is something that they don't have a sense of. But I would say that there's clear reasons. The decisions we made in society had an effect. But there are certain kids that have just been victimized. They've been really injured by it. So they're the blue-haired septum ring kids who have just they've been on ADD, they're on SSRIs for depression or other factors. They've been targeted by the psychological health departments and people. They went to these very liberal colleges. They were given no sense, no principle. And so you see some have just been really broken, and the sexual confusion, it's there. You see the destruction of civilization. Much like when I lived in California, it was very apparent. You walk onto a college campus and you're like, this isn't going to function. So there's that section, but then there's also a section of very smart kids who are still, you would consider them liberal, neoliberal, liberal, Democrat voters. They trust the institutions. They trust the college. They trust the people in power. They haven't confronted the total failure. And they believe the general line, and they've, for whatever reason, rejected religion as kind of irrational. Either the church failed them, they suffered certain tragedies in life, and they lost a sense of God. Typical stuff when you're a kid. I think most of us can probably at least sympathize with people younger, challenged with this, why that, why this, why that. And it doesn't fit when you're younger. And to me, this is really this is what has to be targeted, because if you get these kids, you get a majority. This isn't the majority, but combined with other kids who are conservative and so on, you start to build up a nucleus of a shift on the campuses. And they just generally trust the institutions. And I think there's a core point where the problem breaks. And what you find is that they want this grouping, trust the institutions. They want all of the political rights. They don't have like a burn it down, like the Mamdani communist approach. I mean, they don't pose that, but they're not the types of radicals who just think burn it down. This society's screwed up. They've been broken. They don't have a sense of principle. They've been injured. They don't get it. Their families fell apart. Right. You get the basic format. That doesn't function. But these kids, they've rejected, they believe the society still works. They believe in institutions. They want political rights. They want a society based on principle, but they have rejected any basis in reality for those rights to exist. And to me, that's where the core paradox is. And I'll come back to that really as the main point of this, that this grouping, this kind of liberal, neoliberal, Democrat, trust the institutions, globalization's been good, trade has been good, free trade has worked, services are great, just the stuff you hear in the mainstream media all the time. They've gone through all the things that they've gone through and have kind of adopted this. And at core, there's an axiom for that grouping, which really can be broken. I think we can target it, we can break it, and we can open up an entirely different political potential in the country. We can open up in some ways the kind of creative leadership, like morally grounded, but truly creative leadership that's going to engage in society and solve real problems. Because that's what we're talking about, trying to at least accomplish here. I'm not talking about a passive evaluation here. I've been intervening to figure out what can we do to kind of grip this generation into a kind of leadership. Because what you see from this generation of young people that are turning more conservative, which has been reported now for some time, it's really happened with Trump's victory in 2016. I mean, just to give an example, Charlie Kirk was practically a libertarian. I mean, he wasn't practically, he was a libertarian in his political and economic worldview. He came out of the Tea Party. He believed that libertarian principles were of Western civilization and of the United States. Trump won. He was somewhat skeptical of Trump's campaign, but he endorsed him at the 2016 Republican convention and then worked with Trump's campaign. He was partnered up with Don Jr. for the last, 5 months of the campaign, 4 months of the campaign in 2016. But Trump brought to bear a sense of conservative response to this radical left insanity that was not ideological. It was truly an American approach, non-ideological, committed to the population, to the principles of our Constitution, to the principles of our civilization, to the Christian worldview, but also based on political compromise, political strategy. How do we build a coalition that can work? How do we make this a functioning government? Of course, as we know, it was undermined in every 6 ways to Sunday, as Schumer said in the first term. And Trump's commitment to those principles was then even greater tested, and he prevailed. And all of that approach and his courage and perseverance have shaped a generation of, especially young men, but broadly, people who are responding to this kind of shift and see it as a way of not being victimized. So there's a whole group of them. I mean, kind of remarkably beautiful stories of kids who grew up with atheists as parents. And then when they came to college, became Christian from evangelical, then maybe shifted into Calvin and became Protestant, read Calvin and became Protestant and Presbyterian, then started reading some of the ancient church fathers and became Catholic. One young man became a secular Jewish family, typical kind of just secular left-wing, secular Jews in America. And he's now right-wing Orthodox in the Orthodox community. And he's made all kinds of personal life decisions to kind of that are transformative. And so there's others were kind of very Christian, but like kind of into Bernie Sanders. And they saw what Trump was doing and realized the importance of Christianity, and that there was something about what Christianity brought to bear that was distinct, that needed to be defended, as much as a concern for the poor and concern for, the pot country generally, came from a Democrat liberal family, but realized there's something about what the conservative cause is defending in Christianity that can't be thrown out. You can't take the parts you like of Christianity and then throw out the religion, which is really kind of what is being done. I think we all know that to some extent. But these kids are just kind of remarkable And with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, I did an event. I spoke at a Turning Point event at the University of Michigan last Thursday, and were well attended for their first meeting. And they haven't had a chapter there for like a year or so. And they set it up last at the end of last semester. So they were ready to go even before what happened to Charlie. They had 25 people there. One young man came up and said, I've held these beliefs, but I never wanted to be outspoken about them. It's typical kind of reserved about these principles. I'm just a guy that wants to work with everybody and get along and try to make this whole society work. But I realize now that I've got to now get out there and stand and fight for them. And I wouldn't have come to this meeting if it hadn't been for Charlie Kirk. A young girl, really sweet, music major, double major, one who was in music, very Christian. And she came in very skeptical. Like, I don't know, she didn't leave her name or number or email, didn't want anybody to contact her. She wasn't sure, but she felt compelled to come because she grew up in a Christian outlook that was basically, I look to try to keep my soul protected so I don't engage in the world very much. I don't get involved in politics because basically you're going to be tempted to violate what you know is good, so better not to. But I realized that with what happened to Charlie Kirk, I had to, I needed to find out. And, she said, this was great. This was tremendous. And how do I come to figure out politics and economics? And we ended up touching on music because music is a really important way to keep your soul strengthened. And she knew that there's a difference. I mean, for some of you, if you've ever listened to the classical music station or something or gone to a concert, it's not all classical music in one sense. Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, Schubert. I mean, these guys are giants who helped build our civilization and capture what a Christian worldview is, non-verbally, but they captured as best as anybody. But there are others, the Romantics, the Mahlers, the Liszts, some of the French school. They don't compose from that same standpoint. They're not composing the Christian worldview. And anyways, not to a bit of an aside, but for her as a music major, she knew it. She said, I can hear the difference. I can tell that these guys actually get God in some sense, and these other guys don't. I mean, to put it in those stark terms. And so she was just really excited and and to me, that's a political decision because you're now starting to differentiate who are the people that are really helping to elucidate what our civilization is. Because there's politics and there's economics and there's music and religion, but there are individuals that helped elucidate the principles of our civilization, the kind of Christian principles that have been demonstrated and were adopted as universal in nature. And from that universality came an investigation of creation. How do we build up our nation or our nation state and our state? How do we build up a music that reflects these principles? How do we build up a form of government that reflects these principles? So they were investigating and exploring it. Now we take the academic study as kind of looking at it from kind of upside down. We look at the end result. Well, what do they say politics is? Well, no, what are the principles? What are the universal principles that were introduced? And how did they go from those universal principles to discover then, or hypothesize and then ultimately discover the best forms of government or of economic development or of music or of scientific thought? So there's this kind of eruption, and that, as I indicated in the email tonight, the pursuit of religion per se, and this revival of Christian revival is one very personal. And that's something that I think has been true since the dawn of the Christian era, that something touches people around Christ and what Christ reveals about the loving nature of God, the principle of redemption. And Tony Pappert, who spoke a couple of weeks ago, and I think many of you know, but he introduced me to an Italian novel and it's the Italian novel. It's kind of like Les Miserables for the French. Um, but it's the Italian novel, or War and Peace for the Russians. And it's called The Espoused, or the Betrothed. In Italian, it's I Promessi Sposi. But the Italians recognize that it makes clear for someone who's like 16 or 17 that the ultimate principle of Christianity is, yet great evil exists, but the power of redemption is always greater. The power to find real redemption, to be redeemed in the love of God, and then to contribute to God's creation, even though you've been violating and acting against it, but to be redeemed and now become part of that, to become, to embrace that change, or embrace that worldview, is possible. No one is eternally damned, per se, at least while you're living. And, that, I forget why I got, but for this kind of, this revival of this thing is very personal in that regard. There is also something intrinsic about, like, what Charlie Kirk demonstrated and what Donald Trump has presented. One person, and this has been often cited about Trump, it's almost kind of very familiar now, that he's not he wasn't a church-going Christian. You weren't going to necessarily find Trump reading the Bible or going to church a lot, but he demonstrated Christian principles better than almost all of the many of the Christian preachers combined in our country, because he got into the arena and fought effectively for those principles and brought them to life. And that combination is what is kind of shaping this moment, that there's a personal revival of my own accountability, my own potential for redemption, and to live with a love of God, and to accept God's love of me, that individual power that is uniquely expressed. But then there's also that broader structure of principles that stem from that worldview that the early Christian fathers developed. Some of what we know as the Nicene Creed, or that kind of the councils of what is this civilization. But these were also these Christian fathers, as we discussed, that Bob and Tony discussed on Saturday night in our class series, that these early Christian fathers, Augustine or Ignatius, they were bishops of significant cities. They were pastors. They were responsible for a broad population, largely of illiterate, uneducated people, and had to engage them in this domain of principle. There was an implicit political responsibility, a civic and political responsibility from these leaders who had identified these universal principles in this Christian worldview, in this participation with a Christian God, that then had to become more knowable to the population broadly. And that's kind of what's emerging here. We saw that with Charlie. We see it with Donald Trump in his own way, a very powerful way. And we see it now kind of emerging within this younger generation. So the thing that I think is maybe a major point of focus for our movement is, because what's compelling, what I found it, and one example, I had an extended debate with one of the college Democrats, the president of the college Democrats on one of the campuses I've been attending or organizing and engaged with. And it was an informal debate, or kind of a formal debate with a number of people, for about an hour, and then it spilled over into a hallway for about 4 hours. And what's provocative is that if you present the idea of what President Trump is doing, based on much of what we've discussed on our Monday night discussions, Trump's interventions to end the war, Trump's intervention to end this globalization, corporate-run economic, kind of global corporation-run economic system, that he's challenging that. He wants to go back to nation states and the right of nations to develop, and the right of governments to take the concern of the population first, not some global corporation, not some other foreign interest, but the actual interests of the population directly. And then they say, and if they ask, well, how is he taking on globalization and this corporatist world order? Well, tariffs, closing the border, going after the Fed, dealing with this cheap labor immigration question. Um, you know, and it's compelling for even some of the younger conservatives who are really concerned about, say, the question of pro-life. Because when you look at it, over the last 50 years, since 1975, 60 million abortions have occurred in our country. 60 million. In the last 25 years, it's been 20 million. And the question is, well, who benefits from that? One young kid at one of the campus last week said, in a broader discussion I had on Thursday night, said, well, corporations benefit because then they have women that will just keep working and aren't raising families, or men who aren't raising families. You just have people that are willing to work 70, 80 hours a week because they're not developing and building families and community outside of work. And it's true. I mean, that is who benefits. I mean, there are political powers that have an interest in lowering the population and controlling the population control and population collapse. They have an interest in that because it's easier to control people. It's easier to control populations. And if you break down family ties, they have less to fight for. They have less to defend. They're just trying to survive as individuals. And so that was the kind of opening part of this 4 or 5 hour debate. And so they were all kind of struck by, they might agree, and this is true on all the campuses, all of the left-wing students were compelled to recognize that that argument is solid. Trump is doing those things. He's going after the Fed. He is tariffing. He is setting up these structure. They go, but he's working with corporate leaders. He's bringing them to heel. He's bringing the corporations to have to work with. It's not perfect, not always working, but he's at least attempting to bring these corporations to heel towards the interests of the country and the people more generally, that they can't just maximize their profits and shareholder value at the cost of, plunging the nation into poverty. But that isn't compelling enough to change their minds and hearts, because we're dealing with a kind of brainwashing, a TDS, which is obviously, and everything I'm saying tonight, I don't think just pertains to campuses. And we all know TDS certainly doesn't. But it's just a reflection of maybe the dialogue with young people. So the question is, how do we change the hearts and minds? And what struck me through a course of a number of discussions and then hypothesizing this approach, that I think there's something we can wage a fight and a war on. And if you have feedback on this, if you think it's possible, reach out, contact me, respond to those emails. I think that there's something we can do very powerfully, kind of in Charlie's honor, but to the fight to win and regain our civilization, because these universities, the university emerged because we found it necessary to educate the priests, which were in the Middle Ages still to a large extent civic leaders. They were kind of like the lowest level civic leaders at the parish level. And civic leaders when they became archbishops and, of course, and bishops and everything else, cardinals and so on. The leading foreign minister of France was often a cardinal for many centuries. That to train them, we found an approach of about an 8-year process, like a PhD level of development. This is what people like Nicholas of Cusa, the great cardinal, that kind of brings us into the modern age with his level of philosophical depth and insight. They went through an 8-year course of study, and the university was to develop that sense of those principles of civilization. Now, of course, they've always been used to kind of ideologically control, but the intent of them was to give people a foundation in that course of civilization. They erupt, 11th, 12th century. The universities are key to accomplish this. And what you find with the Democrats on campus and that type, the neoliberal, liberal types, they're not the radicals, is that, and even in case of the radicals per se, many of them are just very injured. They're just less stable as people. But they're still very open to this. I mean, if you see it with Charlie's videos, I mean, we had a transgender student come up and say, well, what do you think of transgender? What should I do? How should I think about this? They actually want a dialogue. They don't feel like they have all the answers. So, I mean, what Charlie did in creating that kind of dialogue on these campuses for these kids who just don't have a sense that they can trust any institution in society in some sense, which is certainly the radicals don't trust a lot. There's just a lot of anger. But with these more liberal types, and with all of them, but I'm thinking of specific conversations, which I guess is why I limit it. The thing that was the most penetrating was to recognize that what they've adopted, so they've rejected religion as something irrational, that from religion, you're attempting to take and hold on to things that you want, but aren't real. So, or you're wanting things that you think are good for society, but you're then creating from the things you want, like political rights, right to freedom, right to free speech, right to bodily autonomy. Of course, a big one for liberals. I mean, until a pandemic hits, but we want these things, but then you're saying we got to have God, and you've got this, and you've got to have that, and all this religious structure, and they've rejected it. And like I said, a lot of it can just be what young people go through. But then what happens is, even though they're going through a typical adolescent process of doubt, of skepticism, of challenge, which you would want young people to go through, but then they're at a university. And universities were set up with a religious structure. Universe is one word, right? It's a single word. It's that the all of creation came from the word. First, there was the word. As we know, in Greek, the logos, from a Christian conception, it's Christ. The fact that Christ was there, he was begotten, not made. That all was created through him, all was created through the logos, all was created through the word. Universe, university. There's a vacuum, as many people have stated, it's nothing new, that if you take the Christian religion out of the university, and there was a time when all of the professors were still going to church, even in the lifetime of many people on this call. If you take that religion entirely out and you make it almost a mockery, oh, you're Christian, you go to church, how absurd, how irrational. Did you hear he goes to church? You can just imagine the conversations, right? The smug snobbery of a Christian. Oh my goodness. Like, it's a big deal there's an MIT professor who's an engineer at the Media Lab, and she's overtly a Christian and talks about it. It's such a big deal that a professor has the gall and, to go to church and defend it and so on, that it's so rare. If that vacuum is filled with another religion, and the question is, with what religion? What is the religion? And some people say, well, it's wokeism. Look, the universities have been bad for far too long to say that it was just confusion over, it was a race and gender obsession, which is generally the components of things like DEI and wokeism that we're referencing. Equity and inclusion of genders and races, and everybody's categorized some kind of victim class. That's true, that has emerged, but that isn't the core. The core religion actually stems out of the science departments. Not surprisingly, because you actually they're defining their worldview based on what they say is the scientific method. We all saw how great that worked during the pandemic. So there's every reason to challenge it. And there's some very insightful people who have recognized that the pandemic exposed the kind of totalitarian nature of the scientific community, that there was a kind of a willingness to compromise the basic principles of society, because in their worldview, PhDs in biology, PhDs in chemistry, PhDs in medical science, and really I would extend it to all of science, from physics to all life sciences to chemistry to everything in between. The engineering's a little bit different, because it's not a study of science per se. It's a study of how to build. But of course, there are still problems in the training. But in these sciences, there's a core philosophical view that has eliminated the existence of principle at core. So we may want them, but we can't justify them in our scientific worldview. They don't exist. And the basic idea of that is nothing new. Many of you are probably familiar, but it is, some call it reductionism or materialism. And I just want to explain what I mean by that. And then this is how I was able to challenge these college Dems into 4 hours of discussion on changing their worldview. And I didn't get like any great Damascus Road conversions. I didn't expect it. But I definitely, and one person just said, I got more out of this discussion than I did out of 4 months of class. Like, I'm challenged, my way of thinking, my identity, my understanding, my knowledge is changing because we're not limited in scope. We're getting at the core questions of the principles, because you can't have your political rights, the things you want to have, equality, democracy, a republic, bodily autonomy, free speech, right to vote, right to this and that. All of that is based. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is based on the underlying assumption or hypothesis that all men are created equal. Well, on what basis? Well, I think most of the founding fathers would say we're all equal from the standpoint of the human soul. They may have put it that way. If not, they would have, I think, agreed to that. That's what we mean. The implication, of course, is that even your black slave has a soul, that you can't divide this. And that was the great kind of PR revolution on that side, to get slave owners, even though there were people in South Carolina who signed that were very much anti-slavery. It wasn't as an economic stranglehold on the South as it later became. But there was, of course, slavery. But that the principle was compelling, and the principle was known to be true within Christian civilization as it developed. And also going back to the ancient Greeks, which is where some of this kind of intersected the Christian development. And you have, similar Judaic contributions in that same way in the development of our Western kind of civilization in question over 2,000 years. And so what you find is that, and you can see it in the eyes of these kids when you're talking to them, they want a soul. They want to believe that love and truth and the intangible, the invisible domain of principle is real. They want to live in that world. They definitely want the rights and benefits of that. These things have meaning for them, and they still have the clarity of mind to understand that. But they've been brainwashed on college campuses, largely from the scientific faculty, of which they're not even really taking. I mean, none of these kids I'm talking to, most of them are not science majors. They're all poli-sci, philosophy, pre-law, basically. But they are provoked on that the human soul exists, and to someone to assert that it exists and it's knowable and it's true, and it's the basis of everything else you want in life, and it stems from a creator. And the problem is that materialism just doesn't get there. I mean, you can't. One was perfectly anecdotal. One young guy says, "Yeah, you can get life out of non-life." I said, "You can?" He said, "Yeah, abiogenesis," which was a commonly held perspective in Soviet Russia, in the communist world. The best Soviet scientists completely rejected it. But you had materialists, of course, there, and we have materialists today that dominate. They dominate our universities. This is partly what makes them so communist. Um, so he looked it up. I said, well, find me an experiment where abiogenesis occurred, where life emerges from some chemical interaction with electricity and other forms of energy to create. I mean, you can create chemical molecules that start to resemble maybe amino acids that are the building blocks of proteins, which are the building blocks of life, and so on. But, there's nothing close to abiogenesis. And so he looks on his phone and probably chat GPTs it or something. And 5 minutes later, there's like 10 or 15 people around the table on this campus. It just erupts all of a sudden when you're on there and talking to these kids, because they just start to engage. And then once they see one or two engaging, they all want to start engaging. And he looks on his phone. He says, after 5 minutes, he comes back and says, yeah, I guess I misread that. I guess we can't get abiogenesis. And so, but they believe that somehow the world they're taught is so scientific, it must be able to explain that I can get life, I can get consciousness, I can get creativity, I can get love, I can get truth, freedom, all of that from non-living, abiotic, chemical matter. You can't. It ultimately becomes the most mystical, irrational, magical, weird possible outlook you could ever hold. And the Greeks knew this. There's leading Greek, or not leading, but they were Greek thinkers who were in some cases were magicians. They were magi from the East who believed completely in an atomistic material world. And the Greeks just knew this is just preposterous. It's absurd. And yet we have lost that intellectual strength, that conceptual strength to ridicule this outlook. And it has seeped into our civilization going back to, no later than to René Descartes, who says we're going to separate the mind and body. So we have mind, we have the body, which we know is, we know what that is. We know what that is. We know what body is. Of course we know. Do you really? But the soul somehow just acts upon it. We don't know how the soul acts on the body. So because the soul is not material, how does it possibly act on material? We don't know. So there's some special mechanism. And you get, Western duality, where the religions or the arts or the humanities, the literature, the intangible domain is in the spirit realm, and then science is in this material realm. But of course, scientists are considered the elites. They know the universe. But we've made no scientific advancements for like 80 years. I mean, I give you an example of the Genome Project. We're going to map the human genetic code, and we're going to figure out what every gene is specifically for. We're going to be able to tell you everything about everything that's going to happen to you in your life, every disease and propensity you have from your genetic code. Can we do that? No, we can't do it. It was the great promise when I was in college. Everybody get into genomics and genetics. It's going to be huge. We've made some great breakthroughs in terms of how to deal with some of those questions in research, but we've not mastered the human organism because of mastering the DNA strand. It just doesn't happen, because ultimately it's just a chemical molecule. It doesn't explain the organism. It doesn't explain the living process. So that's just one example in life. I could go into it in particle physics, in cosmological physics. You can go on and on and on. We've made great breakthroughs in engineering. We can make smaller and smaller and better, more powered computer chips. The engineering field, we can keep building there. But on actual conceptual breakthroughs in science, our civilization is regressing clearly. And it's because that they live in the most irrational and mystic world. And so if there's an effective polemical war waged on the absurdity of that, you will free up this younger generation to adopt both these clear principles, which are just proven true by the course of our civilization and from any just reasonable philosophical thought. It's also revealed to be true in the nature of a Christian outlook. I mean, a Christian view is that the divine and the human are demonstrated to be perfect in Christ and to be unified imperfectly in us. That Christ in that way reflects the ultimate of that Genesis conception of man made in the image of God. That's the worldview that a Christian has that led to and invented and created the field of modern scientific discovery. Now, I've been talking for a little while tonight, but we'll have an extended question session, and I'm incredibly interested to see what thoughts and questions you guys have, just even if it's just not directly pertaining, but in response to this. But let me just say that this is not something merely of a philosophical adventure to rescue these kids and to give them access to these principles. It is one of greatest questions of politics and economics. We aren't making scientific advancements. Our capability of holding together our civilization, of growing our population, of building the new advanced sciences and technologies that we need to survive, come from great discoveries. The last one we really saw was Planck and Einstein. This remarkably profound insights that totally challenged the entire field of orthodox physics at the time. They completely challenged the religion. Max Planck got into physics, and they told him, well, you're kind of coming in late at the game. All the discoveries have already been made. So this pessimism within the scientific field is not new. Like I said, Descartes, early 1600s, like 1630s. So it's been like 400 years. But we need to make scientific breakthroughs. That's how we're going to grow. That's how we're going to recruit and solve a lot of the big problems. That's how you ultimately solve them. Science is not a question of just the abiotic world. It's how do you solve the problems your civilization faces. You've regained the powers of discovery, of hypothesis, of real creativity. Creativity is not dyeing your hair blue and wearing a septum ring like every other kind of enraged, teenage girl. Like, that's not creativity. Getting tattoos like everybody else who's angry and pissed off is not creativity. Creativity is solving the great problems our civilization faces, and this worldview, the development of our civilization through that Judeo but Christian worldview, was intimately tied to that process of hypothesis that you only can make if you recognize that there is, and in some ways, that domain of principle, that invisible domain, is more substantial. It is more akin to God and the logos than the material world is, right? We've inverted the kind of ordering of the world. We've put matter at the top as if somehow everything descends from abiotic matter. But with God at the top, then the domain of principle becomes more accessible to the human mind. And there's qualities of discovery that can be made there. If you're not living in a world that functions that way, you're not piercing the veil of the senses to get into that invisible domain, to make those new creative discoveries. And Planck and Einstein were both very educated. Planck was almost a minister, and Einstein was trained to think of this higher domain by his mother, who was a pianist, who constantly played Mozart with him. And he would often say, I live in a world, I would live in Mozart's universe. So, if we have the courage and capability and political support to take on this kind of fight on the campuses, I think there is a basis to do that. I think these kids are willing to engage in it. I think we can shake and rattle the cages of these materialists and these snobs and these liberals who think they have such control. We can expose that their entire edifice is irrational and mystical, and we can demonstrate the greater truths, both of the Christian outlook, and that includes the Judaic and other monotheistic traditions, but it also puts great emphasis on the role of the individual in profound discovery. And it's that power of discovery which has to be unleashed if we're going to start to solve these great problems. So, anyways, totally fun to engage on the campuses. I think if the weather permitting, I'll probably do it for another 4 weeks. And so you can expect maybe another report back in a month or so, and probably updates throughout this period. But that's what I've gotten from the last 4 weeks. And that's what I wanted to present tonight. So Keisha, I'll throw it back to you and see if we've got, and people encourage people to raise their hand into the queue and have at it tonight.